She stepped into the dealership, her casual outfit consisting of a pair of well-worn jeans and a simple white t-shirt. There was nothing flashy about her appearance. No designer labels, no extravagant jewelry. Just a woman walking in with quiet confidence. She approached the showroom floor, her eyes scanning the luxury cars lined up before her. With a polite yet firm voice, she inquired about one of the high-end vehicles on display. The salesman, a tall man in a crisp suit, barely hid his disdain as he gave her a once-over from head to toe. His expression turned smug, his posture shifting with arrogance. "I'm sorry, but I think you might be in the wrong place," he scoffed, smirking as he subtly gestured toward the exit. "These vehicles start at $300,000. Nearby, a couple of other sales staff exchanged amused glances, barely suppressing their chuckles. A few customers, overhearing the exchange, glanced in her direction with varying expressions, some curious, others indifferent. Her face grew warm with embarrassment, but she didn't argue. She simply turned on her heel and left, her silence speaking louder than any protest could. The next morning, the dealership's pristine glass doors reflected the early sunlight as a striking Rolls-Royce Phantom glided smoothly into the parking lot. Its sleek black paint gleamed under the morning sky, the imposing presence of the car commanding attention from everyone inside the showroom. When the back door opened, the salesman's jaw nearly hit the floor. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Boston Luxury Motors, known for catering to the wealthiest clientele, stood in all its grandeur. Behind its glass walls, the most coveted vehicles in the world sat like museum pieces. Bentleys, Ferraris, Aston Martins, each one carrying a price tag that most people could never afford. Margaret Collins, Maggie as those close to her called her, stepped through the grand entrance, her brown ponytail bouncing slightly with each stride. She wore the same simple white t-shirt, the same worn-out jeans, and the same scuffed sneakers. There was no indication of wealth in her appearance, no outward display of affluence. But what the staff failed to realize was that Maggie didn't need to prove anything to anyone. At 35, she had spent years dedicating her life to something far more valuable than material status. As the founder of the Collins Foundation for Children with Disabilities, she had built an organization that had transformed thousands of lives. Her work, her passion, and her carefully managed investments had secured her a financial standing that many of the so-called elite could only dream of. This morning, she wasn't here to prove a point. She was here for a purpose. Her sister, Caroline, had fought and won a brutal battle against breast cancer last year. Through every grueling treatment, every sleepless night, she had held on to one dream, to one day own a luxury car. Maggie was here to make that dream a reality. As her eyes fell upon the elegant midnight blue coupe displayed on the elevated platform, she knew it was the one. Across the room, Blake Thompson adjusted his tie, straightening his perfectly tailored navy suit. As the dealership sales manager, he prided himself on knowing a serious buyer when he saw one. And to him, Maggie didn't fit the part. He smirked, already assuming how this would go. "Good morning," a younger salesman greeted her with a friendly smile. "Welcome to Boston Luxury Motors. My name is Daniel. Can I help you find something specific?" Before Maggie could reply, Blake smoothly stepped in, cutting Daniel off. "I'll take care of this," he said with a practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Then, turning to Maggie, his tone shifted. "Are you looking for directions, ma'am?" Maggie maintained her composure, unfazed by his dismissive attitude. "Actually," she said pleasantly, "I'd like some information on that midnight blue coupe." She pointed to the $285,000 vehicle. Blake's smile faltered for the briefest second. He had seen this before. People wandering in, fantasizing about cars they could never afford. And with the dealership's end-of-month sales quotas looming, he had no time for daydreamers. "That," he emphasized, "is a limited edition Azure. Only 15 were made this year." His voice took on a patronizing tone, as if he were speaking to a child. "Perhaps I can direct you to our pre-owned section. It's just a few blocks east." Maggie noticed how his gaze lingered on her sneakers, how his judgment was written all over his face. She had encountered these attitudes before, and she had long stopped caring. "I'd really like to see the interior," she persisted, her tone still polite but unwavering. Blake let out a small sigh, clearly irritated. Behind him, two salesmen exchanged knowing looks, already predicting how this would play out. "The Azure is available by appointment only," he lied effortlessly. "Serious buyers typically schedule private viewings." Just then, the glass doors swung open, and a couple dressed in designer attire entered. Blake's entire demeanor transformed. His posture straightened. His smile became genuine. "Please excuse me," he said to Maggie without actually looking at her. "Why don't you take a brochure? Daniel can help you with that." Without another word, he strode toward the couple, his arms outstretched in welcome. "Mr. and Mrs. Harrington. So wonderful to see you again." Daniel, still standing beside Maggie, hesitated before offering an apologetic smile. "I'm really sorry about that," he said quietly. "Would you still like me to tell you about the Azure?" Maggie nodded. "Yes, please." As Daniel enthusiastically described the vehicle's features, Maggie glanced across the showroom. Blake was now personally escorting the well-dressed couple to the very same car he had just deemed appointment only. "That's interesting." Mrs. Harrington ran a delicate hand along the plush leather interior. "It's exquisite," she said, "but I'm not sure about the color." "We can certainly discuss custom options," Blake assured her. Maggie stepped closer, her voice calm but firm. "Excuse me," she said. "I was hoping to purchase this model." Blake turned, his expression tightening. "As I mentioned earlier," he said, his patience thinning, "this vehicle is being shown to these clients." His tone was clipped, irritated. "Perhaps you could come back another time. Or consider our pre-owned section." The couple exchanged uneasy glances. They clearly sensed the tension. Maggie, still composed, said simply, "I'm specifically interested in this car. It's a gift for my sister's birthday next month." Blake exhaled sharply, stepping slightly away from the Harringtons. Lowering his voice, he said, "Look, I understand people like to dream, but this is a place of business. That car costs more than most homes. Now I've been patient, but you're interrupting a legitimate sale." The air in the showroom had shifted. Several customers had paused their browsing to observe the exchange. Even some of the staff seemed unsure of how this would unfold. Daniel looked visibly uncomfortable, shifting nervously. Maggie met Blake's gaze, her voice steady. "I'm prepared to make a cash purchase today." Blake blinked. Then, without warning, he let out a sharp, mocking laugh. "A cash purchase." His voice carried across the showroom, drawing more attention. "Really?" Blake let out a sharp breath, his expression twisting into something between irritation and amusement. Then, with a smirk, he leaned in slightly, lowering his voice but making sure everyone within earshot could still hear. "Humiliate myself," he scoffed. "This isn't some yard sale, ma'am. We're talking about nearly $250,000 here." His tone dripped with disbelief, as if the very idea of her affording such a purchase was laughable. Then, with deliberate slowness, he gave her outfit another once-over, his lips curling in distaste. "People who buy these kinds of cars, they don't dress like that." He gestured dismissively at her worn jeans and plain white t-shirt, shaking his head as if this entire interaction was a waste of his time. Maggie felt her face grow warm, not from embarrassment, but from a deep, simmering anger. Not for herself. She had endured this kind of treatment before and had long learned to brush it off. No, her fury was for every person who had ever been underestimated, judged, or dismissed simply because they didn't fit someone else's narrow idea of wealth. Her fingers curled slightly at her sides, but she kept her voice measured. "I believe my money spends just as well as anyone else's," she said evenly. Blake let out a quiet chuckle, but there was no humor in it. He took a step closer, towering over her now, his expression shifting from amusement to outright disdain. The smirk was gone, replaced by something colder, harsher. "Let me be clear," he said, his voice dropping to a condescending whisper. "You are wasting my time. And quite frankly, you're embarrassing yourself." A hush had fallen over the showroom. Conversations had stopped. Customers and employees alike had turned their attention toward the growing tension in the room. Even the Harringtons, who had moments ago been considering the purchase of the very car Maggie was interested in, had slowly stepped away, clearly uncomfortable. "If you're serious about buying, which I highly doubt," Blake continued, his voice laced with impatience, "then you can schedule an appointment like everyone else. But next time, I suggest you come dressed appropriately for the occasion. Otherwise—" He gestured toward the entrance with a flick of his wrist. "I think we're done here." The humiliation burned in Maggie's chest, but she refused to let it show. Instead, she exhaled slowly, steadying herself. And then, "Is there a problem here?" A deep, authoritative voice cut through the silence. Blake stiffened. Heads turned as a tall man in an impeccable gray suit stepped forward, his presence commanding immediate respect. Richard Mason, the owner of Boston Luxury Motors, had entered the conversation. The tension in the room shifted instantly. Employees stood up straighter. Customers watched with curiosity. Blake, suddenly more rigid, straightened his tie before turning to face his employer. "No problem at all, sir," he said smoothly. "Just explaining to this lady that we operate by appointment only for serious buyers." Richard Mason's gaze moved from Blake to Maggie. His sharp eyes quickly took in her simple attire, her composed posture, and the silent crowd watching the exchange unfold. He was a businessman, and businessmen didn't miss details. His expression gave nothing away, but his next words made it clear where he stood. "I see," he said thoughtfully. He turned back to Maggie. "And your name is?" "Margaret Collins," she supplied, her voice unwavering. "Maggie." There was a slight shift in Richard's expression, almost imperceptible, but Blake caught it. "Miss Collins," Richard said, his tone measured. "Perhaps there's been some misunderstanding. You see, our clientele. They typically understand the exclusivity of our vehicles." Maggie felt something tighten in her chest. Oh, she understood. She understood perfectly. She nodded once, her voice steady. "Your sales manager has made your policies quite clear."